Hi everyone and welcome back to Macaroon. As promised, here's the follow-up to the Jelli World's video so you can see what happened to all the tanks and whether it's possible to create a completely DIY version yourself. I'll be testing out 4 different DIY methods to make the jelly and the results were really surprising, so be sure to watch till the end. As you might recall, even making this jelly using the kit was surprisingly difficult since it involves mixing sodium polyacrylate with distilled water. It doesn't always work with tap water and you don't get enough materials to try again. So this is how the tanks look after 2 months. From left to right are the ones I made using mineral water, tap water, demineralized baby water, and distilled water. I was very impressed by how well they held up since these look exactly the same compared to when I finished filming the first video. All the toys are suspended in the same positions and even the air bubbles are still there. Despite the somewhat flimsy lid, none of the jellies have dried up, which does actually make them quite suitable for room decor. If you decide to make these yourself, be sure to use distilled water so the jelly is crystal clear, and these should last you quite a long time. The only thing worth mentioning is that one of the tanks did end up going moldy. This update was filmed 3 months after the first video, and it happened with a tank that was made using demineralized water for babies. I don't think it actually had anything to do with the water because that came from a bottle, and none of the 5 tanks were sterile because I was touching the toys with my hands. The only possible explanation was that it was really hot in my office during the time this happened, but I still don't know why only the unicorn one went moldy and none of the others. It's not just a black mold, but a slightly orangey one as well, and it looks really gross, which you can see here. It goes without saying that if this ever happens to your tank, then you have to throw the whole thing out, including the jelly and the lid. So even though you can keep this toy for a surprisingly long time, there is a chance that things can go wrong, so be sure to keep an eye on it. Now let's move on to our DIY jelly experiments. I picked out some of the best suggestions from the comments, so a big thanks to everyone who left those. We'll be testing out Jiggly slime, clear Orbeez, hand sanitizer, and bath jelly. I'm afraid I won't be making any DIY toys in this video because the jelly bits turned out more complicated than expected. Out of these 4 methods, only one might actually work, which I don't know for sure myself since I haven't checked on it yet since filming. If you want to know which one it is, then be sure to follow me on Instagram under Macaroon, where I'll post live updates on my story. So the first experiment is Jiggly water slime, and I simply used leftovers from this video. This was still a bit cloudy from the mixing, so I left it alone for a few days. It didn't turn completely transparent, but that's okay since the important part is seeing whether the texture works or not. I actually had very high hopes for this one because we've all seen items mixed into clear slime and it looks so similar to the Jelli World tanks. But right after adding the first toy, I realized that the consistency is very different to sodium polyacrylate jelly. This slime is much stickier and I can feel a lot more resistance when pushing the pieces inside. This makes it almost impossible to arrange the toys nicely since they keep shifting around when you're moving the jelly wand. In addition, the slime isn't strong enough to hold any of the toys in place, so everything ends up sinking to the bottom. Making bubbles also turned out to be a problem because everything you squeeze out ends up rising to the surface. This should have been obvious from the beginning because we all know that air bubbles will rise up in slime because that's how you make the transparent types. So here you can see another comparison of just how different the 2 textures are. Slime is very stretchy and the entire mixture moves around when you pull on a small part of it. This makes it really difficult to arrange toys inside because there's so much movement and resistance going on. In contrast, the sodium polyacrylate has a perfectly smooth surface that doesn't form any ripples when you poke it. The closest I can compare it to is sort of like touching cake frosting or whipped cream. The mixture breaks apart easily and sticks to your fingers, which makes it nothing at all like slime. The next method I want to try out is clear Orbeez filled with water. If you watched the first video, you'll know that Orbeez are made from sodium polyacrylate as well, which is the same material that comes in the Jelli World's kits. However, this alone doesn't guarantee success because there are hundreds of different superabsorbent polymers and each one tends to behave differently. I'm going to start by hydrating some clear Orbeez using distilled water. I left them overnight and the next day they look like this. The cool thing is that if you add more water, then the Orbeez become completely invisible. But since the beads are still there, they can hold up toys and let you arrange different items inside. Unlike slime, there's very little resistance and you can move the pieces around easily. One drawback with this method is that because the liquid is plain water, you obviously can't create any bubbles that stay in place. I was initially amazed at how well this method worked. The toys will display some of the Orbeez, so you need to remove any excess and top the rest up with water. The tank looks crystal clear and nothing ends up falling to the bottom. You'll only notice the texture of the Orbeez if you place something behind it like this. However, this method had one huge flaw which I only realized shortly after filming. Orbeez will continue absorbing liquid, so any water that you added to make them look invisible will disappear very quickly. This is how the tank looked after just 30 minutes. The Orbeez have also become larger, which makes it more difficult to move things around. Crushing up the Orbeez won't make a difference because the broken pieces will simply absorb and expand in exactly the same way. The sodium polyacrylate powder from the Jelli World kits are exactly calibrated so they reach maximum expansion with a fixed amount of water. This calculation isn't possible with Orbeez since they're so much larger and will just continue to expand out of the tank. Sadly, even though this method worked perfectly for a short time, it's not an effective way to create a long-lasting DIY that you can keep. Next up, we've got hand sanitizer. This is the largest packaging size I could find, and I have to admit I was a bit skeptical about this method because the gel looks very thin. I can actually see it rolling around when I tilt the bottle, so it's hard to imagine that this is going to be enough to support the heavier plastic items. I'm using a smaller container this time since I don't want to waste too much product without knowing whether it works. The gel itself contains quite a lot of small bubbles, which I can't figure out how to remove, but I think this depends entirely on the brand of hand sanitizer. I was fully expecting the star to sink to the bottom, but to my amazement it actually stayed floating in the gel. The same applies to the slightly heavier dog astronaut. There's also minimal resistance when pushing the toys inside, and this actually feels most similar to the original jelly from the kit. You can even make bubbles and they stay suspended inside the liquid. I did notice that if the bubbles are too big, then they will rise to the top, so I think this gel has a specific density that can only hold bubbles of a certain size in place. There was one viewer who mentioned adding glitter to the hand sanitizer, so I had to try that out. I'm going to use holographic stars to go with this cute outer space theme. You need to stir the glitter around pretty well, but they spread out quite nicely and stay floating in the gel. This result definitely surprised me, and you can see that the gel is actually so thin that it jiggles around when I shake the glass. However, it can still hold up all the pieces and keep the air bubbles in place as well. I didn't want to get too excited since I know from the Orbeez test that everything can still change if you just leave it for a while. This hand sanitizer cup didn't change during all the time I was filming, but I haven't been back to my office since uploading this video, so I'm just as curious to see whether it still looks the same. I'll post an update on Instagram as soon as I see it next time, so please follow me at macaroon if you want to know what happened. If hand sanitizer actually works perfectly as a substitute, then I can make so many DIY versions of this project. Last of all, I want to test out this shower jelly from Bath & Body Works. This is obviously not easy to find outside the USA and probably not at all practical as a DIY solution, but the texture just reminded me so much of the original jelly from the kit. You can stick your hand inside like slime, but it also breaks apart without a lot of resistance. I'm just placing everything into a cup and letting it settle for a bit. Right away, I notice that the jelly is too thick and tends to crack when you push the toys inside. The mixture does turn smooth if you leave it for a few minutes, but sadly, all the pieces sank to the bottom during that time. It's also far too thick to create bubbles, and I wasn't even able to squeeze out any air because the jelly kept cracking. So this final test turned out to be a complete fail, even though the jelly does look a lot like the one from the kit. I hope you enjoyed this video, and don't forget to check out my Instagram for the final update on hand sanitizer. If that actually works, then I can't wait to make DIY Jelli World's tutorials with it. I'm Joanna, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!